All right, let's dive right in. Today, we are tackling a really big and, frankly, a pretty provocative question. What does the historical record from the 7th century actually tell us about the founder of Islam? We're going to be looking at some academic sources that offer a perspective that might challenge what you think you know.
I mean, just think about it for a second. Today, 2 billion people around the world are followers of Islam. It is, without a doubt, one of the most significant forces on our planet.
And there's absolutely no denying the impact. This is a faith that has shaped empires, defined cultures, and guided the lives of countless people for well over 1,400 years. Its influence is just immense.
So that brings us to the central puzzle, right? How do we square that enormous impact with the historical record? We're going to dig into what our sources say, and they present a viewpoint that raises some really critical questions about the earliest evidence for the standard Islamic story.
Okay, so let's jump into the first major point these sources make. They call it the silence of the century, this idea that there's a profound and kind of shocking lack of evidence from the exact time Muhammad was said to have lived.
And wow, this slide really gets to the heart of the whole thing. The argument we're looking at says that if you scan all the written documents from the 7th century, and that includes stuff from outside the Arab Empire, you just don't find the key terms. No Muhammad, no Islam, no Quran. The people we now know as Muslims, they were called other things, like Hagarenes or Saracens.
And it's not just about written words on paper either. The argument extends to the actual physical stuff they left behind. According to this research, hard evidence like rock inscriptions and coins, well, they don't line up with the traditional story. In fact, some of the earliest coins used by the Arab conquerors actually had Christian symbols on them, like the cross.
Then there's the whole question of geography, specifically Mecca. For a city that's so central to the entire narrative, this bustling hub of trade and religion, these sources claim it's basically a ghost in the 7th century. It doesn't show up on maps, it's not in trade logs, and the archaeology supposedly doesn't show a major city being there at the time.
So you can see the picture they're painting here, right? On one hand, you've got this figure of monumental, world-changing importance. And on the other, you have what these academics describe as a complete vacuum of contemporary, verifiable evidence from the very time he was supposedly alive.
So, if the record is silent, what's the explanation? Well, this leads us to the main theory our sources put forward, that the Islamic story, as we know it, wasn't actually a 7th century phenomenon, but something constructed much later to solve a political crisis.
And to understand this theory, you have to get the backdrop. We're talking about a massive, brutal, empire-wide civil war known as the Second Fitna. The Arab conquerors were literally at war with each other. The rulers back in Damascus, the Umayyads, they desperately needed something powerful to unify their fracturing empire and create a unique identity to say, hey, we're the ones in charge.
Okay, this timeline is absolutely key to the whole argument. Just look at these gaps in time. Muhammad's traditional death date is 632, but the very first time his name appears on a coin or a building, that's not until 691, almost 60 years later. The first full biography, you have to wait another 70 years for that, over 130 years after his death. And the hadith, the collections of his sayings, we're talking more than 2 centuries later.
So what did the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik do right in the middle of this civil war? Well, according to this theory, he took some very specific, very strategic steps. He built the incredible Dome of the Rock, not in Mecca, but in Jerusalem, and covered it with inscriptions that name Muhammad and quote verses from the Quran. He started minting brand new coins, getting rid of the old symbols and putting on a new religious message. This, the argument goes, was the birth of a state-sponsored religion designed to hold an empire together.
Okay, so that's the core theory of a later political construction, but the sources we're looking at bring in some other arguments to back this up.
All right, check this out. First, they point to verses right in the Quran itself, which state very clearly, very emphatically, that the words of Allah are perfect and cannot be changed by anyone. But then, they highlight other verses that seem to, well, create a problem. These verses accuse Jews and Christians of distorting their scriptures, the Torah and the Gospel, which in Islamic theology are also considered the words of Allah.
So here's the puzzle laid out plain and simple. How can God's word be totally unchangeable if it's also been changed by people before? This is presented by these sources as a kind of internal tension, evidence of a new text trying to figure out its relationship with the older religions it was looking to succeed. And this next point is just fascinating. It's about geography and just how far away the storytellers were from the story. The scholars who wrote the foundational texts about Muhammad's life and sayings, they weren't from Mecca or Medina.
They were writing hundreds of years later, from places we now call Iraq, Egypt, Iran, even Uzbekistan. We're talking thousands of miles away. That's not exactly next door, is it?
So, after all that, what's the main takeaway? Well, it's this really sharp line that these sources draw between two very different concepts of Muhammad: the figure of religious tradition and the figure that can be found in the 7th century historical record.
And it really all boils down to this fundamental split. You have the Muhammad of Islamic tradition, the prophet described in detailed biographies and collections of sayings written centuries after he lived. And then you have the Muhammad of 7th century, verifiable history, a figure who, from this academic viewpoint, is simply not there in the contemporary evidence.
So let's just quickly recap the argument from this academic perspective. The central claim is that for a figure this important, the kind of evidence historians would expect to find is missing. No biography from his lifetime, no writings from people who actually saw him, no mention from his enemies at the time, and no solid archaeology for his hometown.
And all of this leaves us with one final, really big question. Not just about this story, but about any foundational story for any of the world's great faiths. It's a question that pushes us to think really critically about how we know what we think we know about the past, and about the incredible power of a story to shape human history.